I think that's a good one.
You put a nail in that one. Hello and welcome to the Hackaday podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Tom Nardi.
This is episode 321. Learn use some 3D printing, let the Wookie win, or design a Thinkpad motherboard from scratch. This week in Hackaday news, I guess we talked about it a couple weeks back. The Soviet Venus probe that was due to hit the Earth did hit the Earth. Cosmos 482 descent craft. Well, it descended, I guess. I'm throwing in the link to ESA's tracker website. They were watching the thing go, and it's fun because they had it as a live blog, and they were like, oh, it passed over, we saw it. Oh, it passed over, we saw it. Oh, it passed over, we saw it. And then the last one is, we didn't see it. It went down somewhere. And it looks like the Russians are saying it definitely went down in the ocean.
I mean, odds are good, right? Unfortunately. Well, I mean, usually it's
fortunately.
Usually it's fortunately. Usually it's fortunately. I think it would have been cool to have recovered this. Yeah, leading up to it, there was even some images were saying it was possible, like the parachute had deployed, which would have been, even better for actually trying to recover the thing. I mean, not only was it built like a tank to survive on Venus, but if the chute was out, there was a better than decent chance that it would have, been recoverable in some form, right? But when you have a planet that's mostly water, it's likely that's where it's going to go down. And I was following this thing too, live that night, and have been looking at updates. No one saw it. Like, there was no reports from anywhere that, I saw a streak or whatever. And like you said, it was sort of the kind of thing where, like, radar contact, no radar contact. So they know, like, what orbit it went down in, but that's about as finely grained as it is. All points to somewhere far offshore, right? So it's not even like, somebody on shore saw it go down a couple miles out there. It's probably in the middle of the ocean somewhere. That's fine, but it would have been a cool thing to recover and to have in a museum somewhere. There was a time in the space race where you're just happy to get things in orbit, and, it wasn't super important how accurate the orbit was or anything. So they just kind of, like, yeeted these things into space. So there are, there's early probes, even of the United States, that, like, are still in orbit and have been for 60, 70 years. And there's, this occasional talk of trying to recover one of them now that we have far superior technology, because it would be interesting to see, what happens to something that has been in space for that long. We don't really have that kind of data, so obviously if it had smashed into the Earth, it would not, it wouldn't maybe not be the best sample to look at, like what happens to a probe that's been in orbit since, before the fall of the Soviet Union. But if we could grab one of these things before they burn up, now that we have, the better tracking and the ability to do rendezvous and stuff, it would be really fascinating to bring some of that early space race stuff back home. And not just for the, the preservation of it, because there is stuff to be learned. Like, okay, this thing's been out exposed for decades.
What happens to the metal?
Yeah, what breaks down? What was the final cause for some of these, satellites that stopped responding? I mean, there's things to be learned. Maybe the something that we'll see more of in the future. As it's one of these things where, like, the cheaper it gets to do stuff in space, the more interesting missions are going to start becoming a reality.
That's totally like a Philip K. Dick novel. You could be like, the Indiana Jones of space, going up there and, like, collecting all of these old early space relics and bringing them back down to Earth.
There you go. I'll read it.
I'm writing it now. Hold up. I gotta type a little bit. Well, what do you think about heading off to what's that sound?
Oh, I'm ready to disappoint myself.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
Okay. It sounds like spooky sci-fi noises from the 50s.
The 50s is wrong.
50s is wrong. Yeah, not even the right decade.
No.
Some kind of a feedback interference kind of thing. I don't know. I don't have anything more specific than that.
It's intentional noise. But okay, good. Well, maybe our listeners do. If you have a clue what this is, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast, where you will find this podcast episode links page. Scroll on down to What's That Sound? Click to follow the link, enter your name and your best guess into our database, and we will pick among the correct answers next week for a Hackaday podcast t-shirt. It is the...
Oh, of course. That one. Oh, I'm sure someone will get it. Of this, I have no doubt.
I'm sure a bunch of people will get it. I wanted to start off this week with kind of a pair of 3D printer articles. And the last few weeks, like every week, has been far out new 3D printer practices, like, just devices that didn't exist a year ago, right? And I want to just tone that back a little bit and point out a piece that I thought was really great because none of it's new. In fact, it's kind of a collection of the last 15 years of hobbyist 3D printing wisdom. And if you weren't there the whole time along, if you're kind of newish to 3D printing, this is an absolute treasure trove of information for you. Best practices for FDM printing, and this is a long piece and beautifully written by Rahix. Like I said, it doesn't particularly break new ground, but this is all the stuff that if you're new to 3D printing, it is new to you, because 3D printed material isn't like anything else you're used to. It's just all sorts of marvelous engineering concerns when you're designing your own 3D print. Like the strength comes from the shell more than it does from the infill. And I remember when we were starting out, we were like, oh, we'll just up the infill because we need it to be stronger. And the answer is no. You up the outer shell when you want it to be stronger. It's like when you do something with fiberglass, right? You put something non-compressible on the inside and then you put something non-stretchy on the outside. It's like what? It's monocoque design or something in car frames. It's this principle that the stress and strain, the pull and push, accumulates on the outside of the shell rather than on the inside. And the inside just needs to be strong enough to transfer that strain to the outside. Anyway, long engineering story short, print more perimeters, don't print more infill. Print cleverer shapes, don't print more infill. There's all sorts of stuff about avoiding overhangs, including the absolutely classic teardrop solution to printing circles, which is actually the RepRap logo because it was such an early 3D printer design trick. If you print a circle, the top part of it, where it's basically flat, is unsupported. So you don't want that. But if you need to fit a round part into a round hole, one thing you could do is you can taper the top of that hole upwards. So it makes it a teardrop shape. You put a little slant on the top part instead of having it collapse, unsupported bridge. Anyway, all sorts of tricks like that about where to put your seams, about designing for adjustability, about how when you print arbitrary holes, the 3D printer tends to cut the corners a little bit and make your holes slightly undersized, and whether you want that or not. You might want it if you can stretch things. The overhanging counterbore trick, he calls it, which is you want to put a bolt into your part and the head of it is on the bottom. So that's the thicker part, and then the top of it's unsupported. You put a tiny little skin across that so that it can bridge that, and then you print the rest, and then you just drill it out or poke hard through it when you have to put your screw in. Okay, I'm not going to go through them all. I'm like halfway down the page. They're all beautifully illustrated, exquisitely sourced. Like most of these point to, if not the kind of original people who noticed these problems and developed these solutions, to kind of really modern versions of people noticing them and discussing them. It's just absolutely fantastic. And this is one of those things, I've been doing 3D printing too long. None of this was new to me, but all of it had me nodding my head the whole time going, yeah. Well explained.
It is a great resource to have because some of this stuff is not obvious at all because of just the nature of, like you said, the material, and also like how the slicer works. And one of my, favorite non-obvious traits that I was glad to see got included there is that there's a tendency, and I did this for a long time, there's a tendency to think that, okay, well, if I just put like big holes in this object, it'll use less material and therefore be faster to print. He does some side-by-sides here, and that's not always the case because, like you said, there's perimeters versus the infill, and if you put enough holes into something, the perimeters that go around those holes can end up taking as much material as like the infill would have if they were just flat, so you can actually make a print take longer and use more material by making it more skeletal, which is like a total opposite of what you would think, right?
If you machine something out of aluminum, you drill speed holes in it to lighten it up, right? But this is the exact opposite.
Yeah, like literally the exact opposite. And it's almost like, how can that be? But, it's all down to just the way additive versus subtractive works, and it's not intuitive. And like my father is a woodworker, by trade, and he knows more about cutting and shaping and screwing together pieces of wood than I ever will. Occasionally he's had me print stuff for him or whatever, and it's interesting to see, like, the assumptions that he makes, which would be totally valid, right, from his life experience, don't work. There was a time he wanted me to print some kind of brackets or whatever, and I said, well, where do the holes go, and how big do the holes need to be? He goes, oh, no, don't worry about that. He's like, I'll just drill them in later. And I was like, no, like,
no,
you're not going to want to do that, and I had to explain to him, like, this isn't going to be a solid object. It's going to have infill in there, and even if it was, you'd want to have extra perimeters around where the holes are. Even if, just drilling through it wasn't, going to lead to its own problems, you want extra strength where the hole is, right? So stuff like that you could assume based on working with other materials that XYZ will work, but it actually can be very detrimental to the 3D printed parts. And I've even seen YouTubers, which will remain nameless, I've seen them like print stuff out and then drill holes in the prints, and I'm like, no, like that's like, we have the technology to just say this is where the hole needs to be. But yeah, just a really great reference. And stuff like if you had, like, we're trying to do like a threaded rod, like, first of all, I wouldn't be printing threaded rods. That's probably step one. If you don't print don't print threaded rods. But if you did have to print some kind of threaded object, instead of just doing it vertically, do it on its side, which means, okay, you're going to lose part of the thread because it's now going to be squared off, but it's still going to work and be a lot stronger than like a thread along the Z-axis would be. So, I mean, there's a lot of really cool stuff in here. Definitely, I would say, if you've ever had problems designing your own stuff for a 3D printer, but even if you haven't had problems yet, it's worth reading through this and saving yourself some aggravation.
Yeah, absolutely. What's funny is we've just come up with a few more things for the list, right? You're like, you're not going to drill holes in it later. Plan your holes out ahead of time.
Yeah.
And,
okay. Yeah.
He's got one of my favorites, which is 3D print your holes a little bit undersized, and then you can tap them out and just, put threads in them. That's one of my favorites. There's got to be a million tricks, but I just thought this was such a great, and, there'll never be a comprehensive list of all the tricks you need to know for 3D printing design. But this one covered it covered so many of the bases. I thought it was really great. In a very similar vein, a new video from Slant 3D, learn 15 print-in-place mechanisms in 15 minutes. The video is kind of one of those, I'm not going to bag on it too hard, but low-effort YouTube videos where it's just joining 3 videos together. But you want to watch all 3 of those videos anyway, so it's really not a problem. But they're all about print-in-place hinges and springs and things like that. If you want to incorporate that kind of stuff into your design language, it's an absolutely good use of your time to go watch those 15 minutes, unless you've seen each of the 3 5-minute videos. I think we wrote at least one of them up on Hackaday before. These are all the things that you should know, just walking into 3D printing.
I didn't know about the RepRap logo. And when you said that, I was like, oh, man, okay. That's why it's that little dewdrop looking thing. It's the hole.
That's how we had to print circles when I was a kid.
When I used to walk through the snow to get our rolls of filament.
We've got vertically oriented circles at home.
Yeah, but I mean, they still do that. I mean, I'm pretty sure some of the Prusa parts still do that. As we speak, I'm looking at the Prusa right now, trying to figure it out. And I guess their trick is they make most of the holes are hexagons, so you have a flat bridging at the top, which I guess is easier to do now than it was in the past.
That's the knobhead trick, too, to make hexagons that circumscribe the circle, because that makes it really easy for the printer to follow the right lines. Gives you 6 points of tangency, a little bit of stretch if you print it a little tight. Good trick. Damn, there's got to be a million tricks. We got to get Rahix to do a part 2.
Well, going down a real rabbit hole, speaking of OpenSCAD tricks, do you ever do the one where you do a cylinder, but then inline say how many facets to have with the dollar, so that you can say like 8
That's
facets
how I make
on
hexagons.
Boom, right, yeah. So you can just say, instead of having to like try to make, because I used to say like I have to figure out how to make a hexagon, and then I saw somebody just did like just do a cylinder with 8 facets, and it'll do it automatically. And
I can't do that math.
it was terrible. I had to like do the rectangles and then rotate them, and it was like 30 lines of code to make a hexagon. And I was like, there's got to be a better way than this.
For cylinders, that's an awesome trick. Triangular prisms, $FN equals 3.
That's a real nerd shirt to get.
Dude, I tell you what.
Man, if anybody recognizes that shirt in the wild.
You could do the Pink Floyd Prism one, and underneath you could say $FN equals 3.
Oh, yeah. Hold on. I think I gotta. That might be a sticker or something I gotta bring to SuperCon.
Oh, dude.
I like that one. Oh, wow. Okay.
Oh,
man. All right. Moving on. Oh, here we go. Well, my first pick this week is turning a Chromebox into a proper power-efficient PC. So this is a video from Hardware Haven, and with all due respect to that individual, I don't think that's really the biggest story here. What I think is cool is that the video is about, getting a cheap secondhand Chromebox, which, if you're not familiar with, is the desktop version of a Chromebook from Google, and making it not a Chrome OS machine. And that involves several really cool projects, from the open source community. And I think those are really the star of the show. And, the main one is from, helpfully to remember, Mr. Chromebox. It is a really, really comprehensive website. Basically lists all the different Chrome devices that have come out. And, especially when they've hit end of life, you're kind of beat. I mean, you can still use them, but they don't get updates anymore. And, Chrome OS is the kind of thing that, they push updates. You're basically using an operating system that's not done yet, right? So you want the updates. And when you stop getting updates to Chrome OS, there's not only the security reason for not using it anymore, but just because all the new kids will get the cool features. What the scripts and everything on the Mr. Chromebox site do is let you basically get a normal BIOS on these otherwise locked down devices, and especially on an x86 based Chrome device. From there, you essentially have a regular computer, whether it's a Chromebook or a Chromebox. And like I said, in this case, the video from Hardware Haven, he gets an Acer Chromebox and runs the scripts on it and gets himself a regular BIOS, and then goes through the process of installing your traditional desktop operating systems on there. Technically, if you're into that kind of thing, you can put Windows on them, but most of the documentation that I've seen out there is for putting some different variant of Linux on there. And one of the nice things is that because Chrome OS is Linux, it's just Google's customized Linux. The Chrome devices are remarkably good Linux machines. Big surprise, right? They were set up to run Linux, and they run Linux well. So most of them, out of the box, everything works. There's no weird devices you have to hunt down drivers for. It's usually well supported by a modern vanilla kernel, which is nice, especially for stuff that's, some of these are a little bit older, and you can have problems when you get older machines, and nobody's wasting a lot of time working on getting support for older hardware, right? But in this case, it kind of came out of the box with Linux support, so you don't have to worry about it. There are some interesting things that Hardware Haven notes in the video, specifically with like power management. I was sort of surprised to find that under Chrome OS, this little Acer box was drawing idle 2.6 watts, which is it's a phenomenally low amount of power anyway for a desktop computer. But when under Debian, it was actually doing 1.6 watts. So it was kind of interesting that it actually saw a pretty significant drop just from that. And that's probably because there's some Google monitoring software running in the background and checking what you're doing that is no longer running. But, the less said about that, the better.
What is the appeal of using a Chrome box instead of like one of those old thin clients?
Like for a normal person or for someone listening to the Hackaday podcast? The Chrome books themselves, they have a big following in education, and if you were setting up a computer lab for a bunch of kids, you got limited IT support and you just want something that you can plug in, turn on, and get these kids online. I mean, I certainly don't know anybody who has a Chromebox at home, and bought it because they were excited about it. I think it's the kind of thing that, they were deployed in fleets and now you can get them for a song. I mean, in this case, I think he said he spent like $25 or something on it for, it's no speed demon, but it's a real computer. It's it's got NVMe. I think it's an i3 processor. He plays Minecraft on it. So for a certain segment, that's more than enough.
I wonder if they just didn't make them over to Europe in the same quantities there in the States, because I went looking for them on eBay just now, and they're like hundreds of dollars, and I'm like, oh,
yeah.
But if they're like $20, I get it.
The first result is $30 for me on eBay.
Man, you guys have it good.
$50, $20. Ooh.
Okay. Back to the podcast.
Yeah. I'm gonna spend some money.
My next hack, let the Wookie win with this DIY Holo chess table, is probably my favorite title of the week. This is a project by Mac70. It's a fairly accurate, if my memory serves, Holo chess table from the Millennium Falcon. What it really is, though, is an excuse to use this awesome hologram material that he got his hands on. This is a film from a company called Osca 3D, and what it does is it scatters light back at you. And so you can project under it and it scatters up through and then it comes back at you, but focused as if it were at the point down underneath, which means holograms. Well, or at least that these are the light things floating in the middle of space illusion. And so it's like Pepper's Ghost, except it doesn't need to be in a box. Actually, it's like a previous illusion that Maker Mac70 used that we wrote up before too, which is a really cool one that uses retroreflective film and a couple mirrors to do basically the same thing. The Osca 3D glass film thing is actually really cool. It's got a whole bunch of mirrors in it, vertically oriented, and they're spaced, microns apart from each other, so that when you shine the light on this flat plane from underneath, the light bounces around in these little mirror canyons and then comes back out in the same direction, out from the top of the surface. And that's what makes the hologram effect work. You project from the object underneath and you get kind of an image of it above this surface. So anyway, who doesn't like holograms? Who doesn't like Star Wars props? This is both of them in one device.
What I thought it was interesting, you don't realize it at first glance. I suppose that's sort of the point. There's actually, I think, like 6 displays under that film, and you're looking at like the reflection of these, and they're little guys. They're like the little cheapy, what are they? 2.4-inch wave share displays. And you're looking at the reflection of the image from them. So to actually move the characters, the displays are physically moving under there on this like gantry system, which I thought was really cool, with servos and like 3D printed rack and pinions and stuff. So it's actually far more complex internally than just like having a screen, right? Like if you just had a big round screen, you would just move the stuff in software. But because of the way this works, like there's actually physical displays shifting around and stuff under there. So it's so much harder to do it this way. But the end effect is very cool.
I've actually seen one of these displays in real life and was pretty much amazed by it. What was it? I was at a trade show, and there was a company called Neonode, which made a really neat reflected light laser sensor that basically tracks your finger as you move it above the sensor bar. And so what they did was they used some of this Osca 3D stuff to project a hologram surface of like a keyboard up there. And then you typed on it and their finger tracker thing read where your finger was. And it was a phenomenally good demo. And I was like, how the heck are you doing this? Like I said, it looks like Pepper's Ghost Illusion, but there's no box around it. So there's no 45-degree mirror light thing there that you're looking at. And I'm like, how the hell are you doing this? And so I started talking with one of the reps, and he, of course, is an engineer. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. And then talking about his sensor, and he gave me one. And I tore it apart for Hackaday.
That's the risk of giving any Hackaday staff member anything. They'll probably take it apart. Like, just know that if you give us anything, it'll probably be ripped apart and photographed.
I actually had real fun trying to reverse engineer it, figure out how their imaging system worked. I'll put the link in for that article. That was such a good time. Good excuse to tear stuff apart.
Well, speaking of tearing things apart for the greater good, my next one is a brain transplant for a Philips smart lamp. And this is a phenomenal, I think, 6-part series of blog posts by Weejin, we're going to say, where they reverse engineer the driver board for a Philips Hue ceiling light. And I felt this one, as I read it, because I've had Philips Hue lights. I've had different smart lights, and while not necessarily the problem that they were having, I don't know, I find them just troublesome. Like, so much of like modern smart stuff, it just doesn't ever seem to work the way I want it to, and it always involves some convoluted app. And I've, had this personal feeling like I wish I could just take out their stuff. Like, I wish I could take out the Philips stuff and replace it with my own. And that's exactly what this is about. It's creating a drop-in board that just turns these proprietary Philips lights into an open source controllable by whatever light. That would be enough for me alone if it was just that drop-in board. But the real cool thing, I think, in this project is the reverse engineering of the original Philips board, because the desire here was to get the functionality as close to the original stock as possible. And they went all the way up to hooking up the original Philips board to a logic analyzer and capturing the PWM signals for all the different like color profiles. The Philips software supports like 300 different colors or something, for different like date night colors. They all these like little themed colors and stuff. So like there was this whole process of capturing all of those and to recreate all those colors exactly, which is totally unnecessary. Like you don't need to do that, but like I really appreciate that it was done, and it's fascinating. Yes, like thank you for taking it that far. I would never have even thought of doing that. The fact that it was done and it was all captured and like is charted out and in these really cool graphs, it's just a fascinating thing to read along with. The end result, like I said, is this open source ESP32 based replacement board that you can just drop into the light and it plugs into the original connector and everything. I mean, this is as literally plug and play as it could possibly be. I don't know, actually, I don't think it was ever said here, if they're selling these boards. I can certainly see them being something that would pop up on Tindy or something, because you really could just open the light, unplug the original board, plug this new one in, and that's it. You wouldn't even need to be, you don't have to break out the soldering iron. It's just so straightforward, and it matches the original screw holes and everything. I mean, it's really a perfect replacement. Really cool hardware, software, documentation. I mean, it's the whole deal. This is, for me, these are the kind of projects that really get me excited, because, not only is it a really cool thing that we get to see, but it's documented so well that you can recreate it and you can learn from it. And it's not, these are the sort of products that like start communities, which is, I think, really cool, right? Like I could see people spinning this off to, work in other Philips lights and improving the software. And you just get the feeling that this is not just a one-off, like this is going to become something bigger. And that's really cool to see that on the ground floor.
Well, I want to bring up Tearing Down a Forgotten Video Game, a video by James about Don't Call It Pong Video Volley. And apparently when Pong was new, there were a whole bunch of Pong ripoff games, basically, and this is the teardown of one of them. Inside, there's just not much in there. It has a couple parts and a Pong chip, Al Williams wrote this up. He knows more about Pong Chips than I do because he says, surprise, it's not from General Instruments, it's from National Semiconductor. And I'm like, okay. And so here's a little bit of the story of Pong. And we'll link to a blog post here from the Name Checks Out Pong story about Pong Chips. And it's just a fantastic read. Original Pong was done in logic chips, in discrete logic chips. And then once you have that, of course, it doesn't take long for someone who knows how to design integrated circuits to say, hey, we could put that in a single chip. And then they did. And so at that point, making a Pong game is, basically design around this chip and is a simple exercise in following the data sheet, basically. What's fun, though, is that the Pong idea was out there and all sorts of different companies scrambled to make these integrated circuits for what at the time was kind of the first home video game. According to Pong in a Chip, it was Atari who had the first Pong chip because I guess Pong was their game. But Texas Instruments came in and made one for Magnavox, who was just about to come out with their Odyssey home video game machine. What were they called? Some of these have fun names to avoid calling them Pong, which I think is great. The General Instruments one, it had tennis, it had hockey, it had squash, and this is where Pong kind of gets interesting. Hockey is, of course, Pong, but you have walls in the back, so there's like a space in the middle where the goal could be. And squash is both paddles are on the same side, hitting against a wall, and so you bounce it off the wall and it goes out. So it's actually kind of interesting. As Al said, the General Instruments one was the big success, but National Semiconductor, MOS was in on it. A company I'd never heard of, Universal Research Laboratories, was in on it as well. I mean, everybody was making their paddle game chips. I think this was a kind of seminal moment in video game history in a way. Like, everybody could now make a Pong game just by buying one of these chips and designing around it. And then this gave birth to a series of these chips where they would have other games on the integrated circuit. And so there was like combat squares, jungle games, road racing games, submarine war games, breakout games, tank battle games. All of them not as a cartridge that you plug into a bigger computer, but like on a chip. And so you could design around them. I think that's a weird and interesting time in the early video game history. And it lasted from kind of 1975 with Pong until maybe 1979. I mean, it was a tiny little sliver of time where video games were in this weird primordial space where they were actually being put on individual ICs and designed around.
Somebody says in the comments that Pong back then was the equivalent of today's like cheap TV game things. Like you see at the grocery store checkout where you plug it into the TV and it has like 15 games on it or whatever. Like this was kind of that version of that, right? Where you had this little piece of hardware that had multiple games on it, even if they were all just kind of variations of a theme.
Well, that was the Atari trick, right? Is that where they had like 16 different versions of the combat cartridge.
Oh, yeah.
15 different versions of...
Like now they're biplanes. Now they're tanks. Yeah.
Now they have
tanks
clouds.
Where the thing bounces. Like, one game was clouds, and then one was without clouds. Like for the strategic
biplanes.
genius. Yeah, back in the day, you could just throw a few pixels on there, and it was a new game mode. Yeah. I gotta say, like, looking at this little clone thing, first of all, it's the ugliest.
Dude,
one of the ugliest
no joke.
devices I've ever seen. I wonder, like, did they get the case from something else? Were they like,
yeah,
we got these cases real cheap. Let's just put the Pong crap in it. Because, I mean, it does not look, I think he even mentions that in the video. Like, it doesn't look anything like a game console. It looks like one of those antenna rotator boxes or something.
Yeah.
Especially with all the ports on it. And I think it's interesting, too, like you said, I mean, it's Pong on a chip, right? So there's remarkably little inside of it. It's mainly just like passive components, a bunch of caps and resistors and stuff. And it's actually like the physical, like the controls on the front and like the ports seem to take up more volume inside the thing than the electronics. Like it could have been way, way smaller if like it didn't have the mode selector switch on the front. Like, it's amazing how like that part seems to be taking up a huge amount of volume comparatively to this, chip in there that actually runs the thing.
Well, it had to fit in whatever like surplus project case this was that they had, right? So they had all this real estate. They might as well fill it up.
Well, my last one here is it's a story we've heard before, but I never tire of hearing it. This one is another old ThinkPad gets a new motherboard. This is a little bit like the question from before. Like, would normal people buy Chrome boxes, or are they for people that read Hackaday? For a normal person, you would just go out and buy a new laptop. But for a certain segment of the hacker population, you will have to pry their ThinkPads from their cold, dead hands because they love these machines so much that they just don't want to let them go. It's gotten to the point now that you can't ignore the age of some of these ThinkPads. In this case, this is for the X200 and X201, which I think are from like 2010ish. And had Core 2 Duo processors and maybe 4 gigs of RAM, and you can run in Linux and keeping things light. You get you a long way, but at some point it's like, well, my watch has as much RAM as my laptop. Like you have to let it go, or do you? Because there is a segment, like I said, a segment of the population that spends their free time developing new motherboards for these old ThinkPads. And with that comes all the new bells and whistles. So you can take your decade-plus old ThinkPad, drop one of these motherboards in there, and now all of a sudden you have the latest, Core Ultra CPU and DDR5, and you got, an M2 interface for your SSD and USB-C and everything you could want. And they've even found new displays to drop into these things because, the original panel was 1200 by 800 or some weird display. So now you can do modern and super high res panels and all that inside the frame of your trusty old ThinkPad. Now, the downside of this is that, as you might expect for a boutique motherboard, it's monstrously expensive. In her write-up, Jenny says, it comes with a little bit of a price tag. And I was prepared for a price, and it was far higher than what I was expecting. It looks like the new motherboard alone is $1,200, if I'm reading this correctly.
Yikes.
And I mean, I don't know that I've ever liked a computer that much where I would have bought a $1,200 motherboard for it. Admittedly, you do get, like I said, all the bells and whistles. It will put you at the top of the line again. So, I mean, I guess if you're comparing it to a high-end laptop, it's not that big. Personally, I gotta be honest, I don't think I've ever paid more than maybe $500 for a laptop. I'm just not that kind of, I have several old ThinkPads myself. I've always been, fine to have a couple generations behind. So, I mean, I might not be the right person to ask about high-end machines like this. To me, that's a crazy number. But, if you need, I'm looking at the specs here. If you need 96 gigs of DDR5 RAM,
hell yeah,
I guess you might be in the market for a $1,200 motherboard for your laptop. I don't know. Too rich for my blood by far, but it's awesome to see that the community is doing this and they keep these old machines alive. I don't know if this is the sustainable kind of keep hardware out of the landfill stuff that we talk about. I think it might be a little bit too high end for the normies, but something like this that maybe doesn't have the specs of a supercomputer. Now that the design. I mean, and this is kind of like what Aria is working on for that Vio palm top or whatever. Like once you have the design of the motherboard, it doesn't have to be a face melting 96 gigs of RAM machine. It could be a Raspberry Pi, right? Like the original hardware still might be faster than a Raspberry Pi, but at least the Raspberry Pi is being produced currently, right? And brings its own interesting stuff to the table. So that's kind of an interesting extension that is possible once you have a documented replacement motherboard out there. You could spin it off into different applications and that sort of thing. So even if this, super high-end board isn't what you have in mind, this could be a gateway to something else.
It's funny that a single person can do this these days. Like, I remember 10 years ago when it was like making your own computer was hard. Not your own computer, but your own reasonable computer. Your own, moderately well-spec computer was really hard. And now here, boom. Oh, here's a motherboard. Oh, by the way, it's a total retrofit for this old laptop, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just, the feat itself is super impressive and really nice to see. But like you could totally like pull this out of your backpack and everybody would be like, "Oh man, that's the oldest computer I've ever seen." And you'd be like, "Oh yeah?" Zzz, and you could calculate so blindingly fast that they would something.
Be amazed. Be amazed at my processing power. No, I think, like you said, that is maybe the biggest takeaway here is that this is possible, right? Like
That's a
with
crazy engineering.
the modern, we talk a lot about the abilities of like the modern maker and hacker and where they are compared to even just a few years ago. And I mean, this is something that would have been not only impossible, it would have been laughable. It would have been like actual science fiction. Like, okay, sure, like I'll make a motherboard for my computer and then I'll teleport to the moon. Like, it would be preposterous. And now it's happening. And we also see it for, obviously it's a little bit easier, but we see it for retro computers too, where it's like, okay, well, we can't get new motherboards for these Tandies or whatever. I guess we'll just make a new one, and you get the original board, and you can again. Well, I'll have to link into work Ari has been doing, where you can take a picture of the original PCB, bring that into KiCad, start drawing traces right over the original thing, and dropping parts in there, and it's not easy, but it's not outside the realm of like one person to do now. Yeah. With open source tools, and then actually get it made, which is the other half of it. Not only can you design this thing, you could then say, okay, now make these, and and even have it assembled. And for it's $1,200 for like we covered. It's not cheap, but it can be done, and even that, like say, it's not cheap. I guess it is, right, in the real world compared to what it would have been. Again, a few years ago, what it would have cost to have this done, it would have been way outside of the realm of any individual. Now, should you, have the money burnt in a hole in your pocket, you can do this now, and you don't need like investments. You don't. Nobody needs to invest in this project. You can do it with your rainy day fund. So it is really a cool sign of the times, I guess, that this is the sort of stuff that's not just possible, but becoming almost, if not common, more common. Let's call it that way, right? Like I can think, like I said, that this is not the first time we've seen it done for the ThinkPad. I've seen it done for retro computers. So I mean, it's happening.
All right, well, my first quick hack comes from Wyatt Roy. Move over Lithopane 3D printed 3D photos with Gaussian splats. And this is a neat solution to a problem that I personally don't have, which is if you have a super fancy SLA 2 resin printer and you can print a transparent layer and a solid layer inside each other, how would you then take a 3D scan, which is a point cloud, and render it into this new medium? And the answer is Gaussian splats, which takes the literal point cloud from a 3D scanner and kind of fuzzes them out to make a 3D surface. It's a neat approach. It's different from drawing triangles or squares on it like you would if you wanted to turn it to an STL. This is just a bunch of points. It's kind of taking the point cloud literally. And I think that's really cool. As Daniel points out in the comments, he does some of the math wrong. And then Wyatt comes back in and he says, hey, wait, I'm just an artist. I just wanted to see how this would look. And they go back and forth. And actually, it's a completely constructive and illuminating discussion. So if you have point clouds and you want to deal with them in a weird new way, or if you have a 2-color SLA printer, this is the article and series of comments for you. John Bumstead, a single pixel moving camera without moving parts using compressed sensing. This takes a bunch of kind of structured light images on an LED array and then focuses them through the desired object onto a single pixel. And it's one of those like LDR light dependent resistors that he's using as the camera here. The point is, if you illuminate the scene differently in a whole bunch of clever ways, the light that ends up at your 1 pixel will eventually tell you how to reconstruct the scene. And it's kind of like JPEG compression, but in reverse and in the physical world. It's a mind bender. You should check it out if you're interested in DSP and or crazy minimalist hacks with optics. And last up, scan your caliper for physical part copies from Scale Edition. This is like banana for scale or putting your parts on a bed scanner to figure out how big they are, but with the added twist that you leave the caliper in the image. So not only do you not have to calibrate your bed scanner to figure out how many dots per inch you really have, you've actually got the calipers in there and can import into your CAD with an exact measurement along with the image. Bananas for scale, calipers for scale.
It's interesting. I've scanned the thing and then just measured it in the real world and then just put that, you know what I mean? Like it never occurred to me to put the caliper on the scanner.
Leave the caliper in the scanner.
I've done the trick a bunch of times where I scan something and then just said, okay, it's 50 millimeters or whatever, and I'll scale it to that.
But you have to write that down on a piece of paper, and then you lose the piece of paper.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, damn, how big was it? I have to get the calipers out and measure it again. Oh, no, you don't. You have a picture of the calipers.
Well, my first quick hack is studying QR code degradation. It's an interesting project from Human QR, and their goal is to basically collect a bunch of broken QR codes and try to find some automated way to repair them, which is an interesting goal. If you know anything about QR codes, there is a certain amount of error recovery ability in there, but as pointed out, that's sometimes compromised by cute little logos and stuff. If you ever seen a QR code with like a logo in the middle, that's actually done at like the cost of error correcting ability, because they're using some of that error correction to put a logo in the middle. There are codes out there that are susceptible to being damaged, and if it's on a piece of paper and the corner gets ripped, or if it gets worn off or whatever, you could have a large chunk of the code and still not be able to read it. So this project is asking you to send your codes in, send your pictures of them in, and if they can, they'll fix them, which is cool. But if not, it'll at least get put into their database where they're going to try to find some commonality, develop some kind of brute force software. It's a little bit hand wavy at that point, but at least it seems like a cool project, and doesn't cost anything to send a picture of your non-functioning QR code to them. Next up is the world's longest range LED flashlight. I don't know that we can confirm or deny that it's the longest range LED flashlight in the world, but that's what Apprehensive Hawk 6178, that rolls off the tongue. That's what they say it is. It's impressive, right? It's got 48 LEDs wired up, powered by a monstrous 40-cell battery. It's got like a half a dozen heat sinks to keep them all cool, and fans, and supposedly all the hardware came in at around $2,000 US, which is quite a bit for a flashlight. I should say that it's being called a flashlight here, but it's much more like a bot light. You'll need two hands for this one. This is not something that you're going to put in your glove compartment. Not only is it ridiculously bright, it's got Bluetooth control and all kinds of cool little details. So if you're in the market for making a monstrous LED light, this might give you some interesting prior art to work from. And this last one, open source electronic intelligence accidentally from NASA. This is kind of a weird one. There's a NASA SMAP satellite, SMAP. My understanding is designed for moisture data. Yeah, soil moisture data. And for whatever reason, you do that by detecting the 1.4 gigahertz band. As an interesting side effect of that, apparently a lot of drone stuff, a lot of military drone things happen in that same frequency, which is kind of the first I'm hearing of it. So if you pull down the public data from this NASA satellite and overlay it on a map, suddenly you see these very big hotspots that I guess would be extremely moist soil, but in fact are like drone command centers or jamming hardware. So on the page it shows all these red spots in Ukraine and in Russia, because obviously there's a lot of drone activity there right now. It just an interesting side effect of having this public data out there, and have to wonder if more people will be using it to detect drones than moist soil when all is said and done.
Well, it's time for our Can't Miss articles. These are long-form pieces written by our fantastic Hackaday writing staff. This week I wanted to pick Dan Maloney's Radio Apocalypse Meteor Burst Communications. We've got a radio theme going on today.
Oh, yeah.
Meteor burst was invented in the 1950s and came from a really interesting realization. At just around that time, they started to want to send not just voice anymore over radio, but also data. And for long-range propagation, the stuff that bounces off the ionosphere has to be relatively low frequencies. And so this is what ham radio people would refer to as high frequency, but that's because they were talking about it back in the 50s. This is kind of 30 megahertz, up into the hundreds of megahertz. Nothing much higher than that bounces so nicely off the ionosphere. And then a scientist in Japan, Hantaro Nagaoka, discovered that meteors going through the atmosphere would reflect radio back down to us and reflect radio back down to us at a much higher frequency, one that you could use to get a higher data rate across. And this gave the crazy American military the idea of bouncing radio off of meteors to allow them to take advantage of the higher frequency to push along a higher data rate. And this was the Communications by Meteor Trails system, which by the US military can be stretched out in the acronym COMET, which is a pretty damn good one for bouncing off of meteors, although they weren't comets. Anyway, it's been rebranded now Compact Over the Horizon Mobile Expeditionary Terminal, because that's the terminal that uses it. Bad acronyms left, right, and center. I have a friend who actually does the same thing, but with airplanes. And airplanes are even more fun because they're super reliably in the right place. You can look at flight radar and figure out where they are. And then you can say, oh yeah, that will be in the right place to bounce a signal over to someone here. And so you point up in the direction of that plane and it bounces back to your friend. Really fun. Anyway, Meteor Bounce got them kind of 2,400 baud to 3,000 baud, which was a big deal back then. It hasn't been used super much since, I guess, except dimensions for the SNOWTEL network, which was a snow depth sensing science network that would transmit its data by Meteor Bounce, because these were often in super remote locations, and it was a low power way to get out a small amount of data back to a central station to record, how deep the snowpack was wherever they were. So just a crazy mode. It's something you can do if you're a ham radio person. How many meteoroids are in the atmosphere at any given time? And the answer is between 1 million and 10 billion, depending on the day. And some of them are too small to bounce stuff off of, but a lot of them aren't. And so what you do is you just broadcast, and eventually something gets reflected back. And if you're sending short enough packets, you can get lucky. Because as you can imagine, these things, they're up there for like half a second to a second or two. Not long enough to send, the entire text of Moby Dick, but if you just need to get a few bytes across, it could do it for you.
So I have to admit, when I first saw this thing, and I would certainly classify myself as a space nerd, right?
I would too.
Yes, many people will classify me as a space nerd. Even still, my first thought was like, how many meteors could there possibly be? Like this, I was like, how could this be practical? Like, what do you wait around all day for the one meteor to bounce off its tail? But like you said, Dan talks about in here that you're talking about millions of these things. So it's not, the mind goes to like this shooting star that like you're targeting with a directional antenna and bouncing off of. But it's really more of like a layer of pulverized space stuff, that you can kind of bounce off of. That, like you said, is not 100% reliable, but more often than not is there and can be, used to our advantage. Like I said, up to 10 billion. Like the number is hard to wrap your mind around. Yeah, it's it's kind of like a temporary mirror of garbage that you can use if you're lucky. That is also invisible, and we didn't realize was there until we needed to have it, and then we're like, oh yeah, look, this is something we can use.
Bill writes in the comments that there used to be a data communication for long haul truckers in the 90s that used meteor scatter. Wallace Owen used to work for the Navy, and he says they got 5,000 bits a day statistically. Average packet size was like 16 bytes with 12 bytes for payload, and they would just be sending them out all the time, and every once in a while they'd get through. Alloy Dog has made contacts on this. He's thunderstormed to bounce over London, etc., etc. It's funny, all the crazy things you can do, and that we couldn't I'm with you. I can't see them, so I don't think they're there. But but I guess that's not true.
So he mentioned in the comments too that I guess this was something that they were kind of counting on for like end of the world apocalypse kind of stuff, and it said
Right.
like one of the reasons that like Strategic Air Command and stuff like this idea was that, you know, should we be at the point where nukes were being detonated in the atmosphere, it would give even more ionization that we can be used to bounce off of. So this technique would work particularly well in a nuclear Armageddon, which is, you know, if that's your business, then
Well, that's nice.
you know, always the silver lining. Perhaps literally a silver lining in this case. When the nukes start falling, I'm not sure what the sky is going to look like, but every cloud has an ionized lining. Well, scandalously, I'm going to talk about my own write-up. This is RTMS statement deepens the libOGC license controversy, and this is a follow-up to something I wrote last week, which has its origins, I think, like 20 years ago now. It's something like that. It's actually quite a long story that starts with the release of the Nintendo GameCube. That is the GC in the libOGC. And the idea here is that libOGC is a C library designed for creating homebrew on the GameCube and then later on the Wii, as they were architecturally very similar machines. It would not be an exaggeration to say that pretty much every kind of homebrew program for the Wii or the GameCube, and we're talking about, you know, people port emulators to the GameCube, somebody ports Doom to the Wii or anything like that, used libOGC as the backbone. It was what you used to actually talk to the hardware. And going back as far as, you know, maybe 08 or so GameCube was, what, 2001-ish? September 2001. So going back to around like 08, which is at that point, you know, like 10 years-ish, there were some rumors that like libOGC had used leaked Nintendo stuff in some capacity, but it was never really proven one way or the other. And, you know, there was a certain feeling that it was a victimless crime to, you know, use leaked Nintendo stuff to enable people to play more games on their hardware, right? Not a lot of tears were shed for the multi-billion-dollar game company. So these concerns were sort of put to the side as a necessary evil, let's say, right? For those that were in the know. And with time, libOGC got more popular, and then the Wii came out, and then it got even more popular because the Wii was a phenomenally popular machine itself and had a lot of homebrew. Everything kind of came to a head earlier in the year when there were more accusations against libOGC that this time, instead of taking code from Nintendo, which was everybody was kind of on board in a, you know, Robin Hood sort of way, it turns out that there was code taken from other open source projects, and that is a line in the sand that a lot of people will not stand for. If you take this kind of thing seriously, pulling code from another project and not attributing it, or worse, denying you're using it and trying to hide it, is kind of an affront to the whole open source ethos, right? And a lot of people got upset about that, and there were some accusations being thrown this way and that way, and different people were trying to prove that code in libOGC was pulled from this project or that project, but it was all sort of hearsay. I mean, you could look at two files and say, hey, look, these are almost the same code, and look at just different variable names and different, you know, different function names. But it's not outside of the realm of possibility that some of this stuff could be developed in parallel and end up being very close. You know, some people had pointed out that, you know, if you're working on a constrained system, there's only so many ways to make an omelet, right? And it's not impossible that you would arrive at a similar way, and it wasn't necessarily code being copied, just, you know, the end result of two people doing the same thing on the same hardware. Well, it went from hushed, you know, theories to, I guess, as close as you're going to get to a confirmation on May 6th, when the RTMS project put out an official statement that said, you know, hey, we've heard enough rumbling about this that we looked into it, and yeah, like, yeah, libOGC copied a lot of our source code. And not only does it appear they copied it, they actively fiddled with it to make it look less like it was a copy. It was the classic, you know, you can copy my homework, but just, you know, change it around so it looks like you didn't copy it, right? The crazy thing about it is that RTEMS, which is, by the way, real-time executive for multiprocessor systems, although originally was missile systems because it started as a weapons thing back in the day, is an open source project itself, right? So there's no reason to take the code and pretend you didn't, because you're allowed to. And that's kind of, I guess, the wild thing is, and they say in this statement that, like, you didn't need to do this. Like, there was no, you could have used the code, and because RTEMS is licensed under the BSD license, which is remarkably permissive, like, all you had to say was, like, yeah, we used the code. Thanks. Like, it really is a matter of, like, just say thanks, and oh yeah, technically you gotta include a copy of the BSD license, but it's like 2 paragraphs. Like, it was more work to cover up copying the code than it would have been to just do it the right way. And I've now written 2 articles about this, and I don't know why you would do that. The whole point of these products being open source is that you can copy the code and you can share knowledge. So to pretend that you didn't, I just don't get it. And now that I think with the injured party, coming out and saying, like, yeah, you obviously copied our code. I mean, I think that any kind of pretext of it just being happenstance is now out the window, right? Like, I can't imagine they're going to keep saying, oh, it was just by chance that our code looks so similar. Like, they're going to have to own up to it. I just don't know why it got to this point. And I guess that's kind of the biggest takeaway for me is just there's this mentality, like, that some people don't want to admit to that they need help. I guess is what it kind of boils down to. Is like they didn't want to say, we didn't know how to do this, so we had to find somebody else who did. Like, and it could be some weird hacker point of pride that, oh, I wrote the whole thing myself. But in this case, a lot of the code was apparently with, like, multi-threading and stuff, and, like, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel for that, for every project, right? Like, if there's resources out there like this, just use it and say, yeah, I used it. Like, there was no downside. But here's where things get really interesting. When the RTEMS team looked into libogc and confirmed that they used their code, they also found there's some pretty strong evidence that libogc used code from the Linux kernel. Now, that is a whole different story, because as you may know, the Linux kernel is licensed under GPL, and whereas BSD is very permissive and lets you do pretty much whatever the hell you want, GPL is notoriously not so. There's some people who actively avoid GPL projects because they, just using code from a GPL project means that your code now is GPL, and you have to follow a whole new set of rules that you might not have wanted to follow. Projects that use your projects will now have to. If it is true that libogc is using code from the kernel, and I gotta say, there is some pretty compelling evidence that says they copied some stuff verbatim, now the problem got way more complicated. When it was just the BSD code, they could have literally added a line to the README that says, hey, thanks for the code from RTMS project, and, include the library. Now you're talking about they may need to relicense the entire thing to GPL, and that can be a nightmare because, the common convention for that sort of thing is that you have to contact all the contributors and ask them if it's okay that their individual contributions are switched over. And as it turns out, apparently there was not a great record keeping of who was contributing what, so it's probably not even possible to figure out where all this code came from in a project that's, decades old like libogc. So relicensing may not be viable and getting down a really bad place. And it could be, and this is something that, I did bring up in the original article I did about this, that it might be that the code base is just so tainted at this point that you're not gonna be able to figure out what's right from wrong and what's who's, and it might need to be unpleasant as it would be. It might just need to be started over. It might have hit the point now where you have at least one project that's saying their code was taken. Linux would be a second one, and they kind of mentioned, like, if you're taking code from 2 projects, taking it from 3 or 4 or 5 really isn't out of the realm of possibility either, right? So it could be that this code has just become so toxic, for lack of a better word, that the community just has to kind of like walk away and start from scratch. And whether or not there's enough interest and energy and talent to make that happen is kind of yet to be seen.
It's an ugly story in the end. I was holding out the hope that some of this was done, by accident, or it was going to be the BSD thing and they could just say, oh yeah, BSD code and everything's fine again. But the Linux code being under a different license and requiring that huge sign off, it starts to make it really sketchy. The real lesson to learn out of this is if you are using code that isn't necessarily clean, it can mess up your code base. And it's like, it's like that XKCD cartoon where it's, he's pulling on the one block that topples the whole
Right.
internet, right? Like it's that library that's got dodgy license violations that's going to get you in trouble. And I kind of agree with that. And yeah, Hector Martin sounded the alarm on this one. And it looks like he's heading up a project to rewrite some of the libogc stuff, and I hope that happens. That, I think, would be the best possible outcome, that the emulation community gets some clean software that they can just then plug in and move on. The good news to come out of this is that it looks like this problem has been recognized and well documented now, and that will hopefully give impetus to work on a solution to it. The other good news is that I'd never seen this RTMS real-time operating system before, because apparently I don't design missile systems. But Al Williams actually knows these guys and says, this is a really cool RTOS and it should get more exposure. So if the weird side effect of this whole licensing fiasco is that a bunch more of us who are playing around with embedded multi-microcontroller systems find this embedded RTOS, heck, it might be a net win. So, quick plug, go check out RTMS. Looks like a cool minimal RTOS. And, if it's good enough for missile systems, it's probably good enough for your Blinkies.
It's an interesting point because Al did get me in contact with some of the people over there. And one of the things that they said was that, they think the fact that these two projects were in such wildly different spheres is maybe why nobody noticed this for as long, because it's not like it took code from another, like an Xbox hacking project or whatever, right? Where like there might be some overlap. Like it was literally like, we have the GameCube over here, we have like intercontinental ballistic missiles over here, and they just didn't have a lot of overlap. But if you were in aerospace, you would definitely know this project. And in talking to some of the devs over there, like it's running on satellites. It's I think some of the Mars rovers run it. I mean, it is like, if you know, right? Like for them, the Wii hacking is the weird, is the weird fringe code. Like they know what with this? Like we're running GPS satellite and they're playing Donkey Kong. And who would have thought, right? Like those are two. How do you get from A to B? I guess at the time, when they were doing libogc, they said, okay, well, we need the multi-threading stuff. Like modern game consoles are basically computers, right? So like to write software for them, they have APIs and stuff. The GameCube and to like a lesser extent the Wii, they weren't really whole computers on their own. And so you needed to do all that stuff on your own. So you actually had to figure out, okay, well, how do I do multitasking? How do I talk to the hardware? So they needed to do this low level stuff. And that's, I guess at the time, this was the only thing they could find that offered that kind of low level code, because it was being written for satellites and missiles and other things that don't have an operating system on them out of the box. So yeah, like I said, it's a very interesting Venn diagram there of how these two projects got linked so far in the past and only now is kind of coming to light. If you need your homebrew games to work on the moon, like this is what you want to use.
Well, that brings us to the end of this week's Hackaday podcast. Thanks very much for listening. If you see something you want to appear on Hackaday, drop us a line, tips@hackaday.com. And to follow all the links we mentioned here, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. And until next week,
keep on hacking.
My mouse is acting up, I think. Angry podcast.
Angry edition, I like that.
Hello and welcome to the Hackaday podcast.
Okay, here we go.
Wow, why do I say head on over?
Like the cheap TV game stick.
Bah, perfect. That's it. That's the end of that one.
Did you hear that weird fighter plane in the background?
I got lost. Lost in Hackaday.